The bugs I think are late too, but they cut lithified resin. But then you got dolomite on top of the glass and everything. Did you ever? You can have the end. I keep forgetting to check with you. Yeah, where do you want? Sorry. Is it all ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's great.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another Bureau seminar series. Before I start, today I have a little announcement. We are a little bit particular on time today, as there is another UTIG conference seminar at 10:30. So any extra extended discussion we can take to multipurpose break room. Okay, so today our speaker is very own Bureau speaker, Bob Loucks. It's my pleasure to introduce him, and I don't know if I can do justify in that. So Bob is a senior research scientist at the Bureau of Economic Geology. He received his BA degree from the State University of New York at Binghamton in 1967 and PhD from UT Austin in 1976. He has wide variety of research, but mainly he focuses on include carbonate mudstones and siliciclastic sequence stratigraphy, depositional systems, diagenesis, and reservoir characterization. He's presently working with RCRL and STAR programs. Thank you, Bob, and the stage is yours.
Thank you, Priyanka. Well, good morning, everyone. And today, I'm happy to say I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite rock units ever. I've been working on it for 45 years or so, all aspects of it. And it's the Lower Ordovician Ellenburger Group, which occurs throughout the state of Texas, but mainly we study it in the Permian Basin. And what I want to talk about is not the hydrocarbons associated with today, but the potential of it or the use of it for wastewater disposal and CO2 storage. I've had several projects in the last year where companies have come to me to look at a particular core I'll show you today that's addressing these problems. Not worried about the hydrocarbons, but using it for something else. And so that's what I'll be presenting today. And I want you to note my co-authors, Chris Am, Kelly Atori, and Taylor Sanchez. Taylor is with Pioneer. That's one of the companies I worked with on this. So what's the significance of this talk? The Ellenburger is a well-documented hydrocarbon play, and it continues to be a hydrocarbon play. I get emails once in a while from my peers out there in the industry asking questions about they just drilled and they found this or that. But really what was interesting, in the last couple of years, Pioneer is one company that approached me about a particular core, which I'll show you today, for wastewater disposal. And then just in the last few months, I worked at another company on CO2 storage, very close to the same core I'm going to show you that they're looking for. So the major goal of what I want to present today is provide the background geology to understand the pore networks in Ellenburger Group, because that's the major thing these people want to know. What are the pore networks in these rocks? Because you often look at the Ellenburger, it looks like tombstone, but it's produced for numerous years, and then it takes injections of quite a bit of water. And I also want to point out that the talk I'm giving today just got published in Marine and Petroleum Geology in February of this year. And those of you who are looking for places to publish and get things out fast, Marine and Petroleum Geology is a pretty good journal. It's got a high rating. And I submitted the paper December 22nd of last year, and it was published by the middle of February. That's pretty amazing compared to other ones relative to the journals that we go for. Okay, a major question is, where does all the oil and gas come from and injection wastewater go in the Ellenburger? Because again, much of the Ellenburger you look at, it looks like tombstone. And my years in the petroleum industry, we always had that problem. Our engineers always thought it was looked too tight to produce, but low porosities of 3 to 5%, but it always had hundreds of millidarcies permeability. And that's what we'll get into. So, but it's just obvious because of the production and injection that there must be storage somewhere. But what is it? There must be permeability. The stuff goes in and comes out. And the problem is the pore network is such a megatype feature in the Ellenburger, and there's several types of pores that it's hard to characterize it just from core by itself. So to answer these questions, I'll first discuss lithofacies and depositional systems. Look at the karst processes and karst zones in the Ellenburger, and then look at the processing permeability network that results from these two previous parameters. Okay, the area that we're looking at, or the core I want to show you, it's right here in Upton County on the eastern side of the Central Basin platform. There's the Permian Basin here. The Ellenburger Group is Lower Ordovician. It sits on top of the Bliss Sandstone, and underneath the Simpson Group, the Upper Ordovician. Right here, this is the Sauk-Tippecanoe megasequence on conformity. That can range throughout Texas anywhere from just a couple million years of time to over 100 million years. And a lot of that, some of the Ellenburger top is missing in the zone and through here. And Ellenburger time at deposition is about plus or minus 16 million years. Okay, before I get into the geology or go any further, the one term I may be using that some of you aren't familiar with are microbialites. And so I just want to give you a short introduction to microbialites. They're essentially made up of microbes or microbial material. They're unicellular or small multicellular organisms, including bacteria. And in the Ellenburger, there's a particular type of microbialites that are thrombolite. But just to show you some modern ones, these are from Shark Bay, Australia. These are in the intertidal zone. They're buildups in the zone through here with carbonate sandy sediments in between them. Here's a cross section of a type of microbialite. They're very well laminated or bedded, and it can be either no skeletal secretion, such as just like sticky tape. The algal mat, bacterial mat itself is sticky, and it'll collect grains on it. But many of them that I've studied actually probably had a magnesium calcite skeletal framework or layers being produced. And just to show you this, as I grabbed off the web to show you there's many types and shapes of these things. A lot of people can spend their lifetime just studying the different ones, so there could be many different shapes, but they're basically they grow up, build some relief, and they're domal or digitate or fingered like. Okay, here is the core that I've studied. It's a nice 1,200-foot core. It catches the top of the Ellenburger Group up here, and it just misses the base of the Ellenburger Group down here. And it's like about 1,200 feet thick. Oh, I want to mention too, I mean, here's the core description, the log and stuff. This is one of the cores that Charlie Kerans, so the bureau here in the department, used in his studies in 88 through 1990, where he did some really early significant work on explaining the Ellenburger lithofacies and some of the karst systems in it. But the core description here provides the lithofacies, the mineralogy, and then the karst facies or karst zones over here. And the interesting thing about the Ellenburger, it's a challenge to log because one, you've got to log it for lithofacies first, but often the rock is highly dolomitized, which makes it hard to see what the original grains were. If you're experienced enough in carbonates and you use special thin section techniques and stuff, you can see through a lot of this. But then you got to go back and relog it for what were the karst zones on top of it, because it's extensively karsted, which breaks up the rock, big holes in the rocks, a lot of claps, fracturing, breccias. The wireline logs are interesting too, because generally they're not much use. They're pretty much what we say railroad tracks is. A gamma ray log, it shows a lot of small changes, but there's not much you can see from it, except they show up cave zones very nicely, because cave zones get argillaceous material or clay in them. And so they show a positive gamma ray response, like here, and a couple of these down here are actually cave sediment filled zones. And then the company I was working with, Pioneer, they were very interested in this marker here. They thought they had a good stratigraphic marker here that could carry around. This turns out to be the base of the meteoric karsting zone. This is a digenetic marker, not an actual lithofacies marker. So here's the core that captures the top of the Ellenburger right up about here. Here's the base of the core. We're missing about 90 feet at the base out of these 1,200 feet. And again, we're displaying lithofacies, mineralogy, and the cave facies or karst zones. But I'll point out here, all the material went through here, the green zone here. These are all the microbialites. So the Ellenburger in this location, environmental-wise, had long history of microbialite deposition. It goes all the way up through here. But there's a lot of this is cyclic. Interbedded with the microbialites, you're going to find some ooze, you're going to find some evaporites. There's a bunch of cycles in here. And then the Ellenburger itself, so in the facies, you have the lower microbialites, and you're going through an interbedded facies where you get peritidal sediments come in. And these are very muddy sediments. They're deposited in the peritidal zone that's going from very shallow subtidal to supertidal. And they're mainly just mudstones coming out of that. And then you go back into some microbialites, then the top part is dominated by mudstones or the peritidal sediments. And I'll show you pictures of all these. But karst-wise, up to this marker here, this is essentially pretty much unaltered host rock, not affected by the karsting. And then the karsting does affect down to about 700 feet of rock. So here's all this meteoric karsting going from the surface, reaching down as deep as 700 feet on this broad platform. And then we could tell you got inside of here, you got cave sediment fills. These were collapsed cave systems where cave sediment actually worked their way down that deep. These, the yellow colors through here, these are a lot of the different types of breccias going all through here. And I'll show you pictures of all those. Then at the very top, right through here, you have a 105-foot sequence of cave sediment fill, which I'll touch upon. This is a very interesting feature. There's some controversy about it. I'd like to show you my interpretations. So here's the location of the core on an environmental map. This is by Ross from '76, and Charlie Kerans modified it later. The Ellenburger was not deposited while the Central Basin platform was high. This was a broad, the Permian Basin and the different features developed somewhere starting in Pennsylvania and going up to the Permian. Back in the Ellenburger, Lower Ordovician time, this is what they call the Tobosa Basin. Broad area through here, deep water out here, broad giant platforms back through here, extremely wide, giant platform. There's a controversy whether it was truly a basin or just a shelf edge of deeper water. But because of thrusting here, any data to solve that problem is missing. But essentially, there's no central basin platform. But Kerans was able to point out there are zones, environmental zones in here. This is more of an open marine zone down here. Then this really broad zone of more restricted shelf area. That's where we are, and it fits what I'm saying with all these microbialites and tidal flat or peritidal deposits. And going back, this is some exposure areas in through here. So I want to show you some pictures of the different lithofacies, and this is a let me go back a second. This is a little schematic cross section right here, or model. This is not meant to be a timeline, or I mean, this is just a cartoon to help explain the features I'm seeing. And remember, the Ellenburger's deposited during about a 16 million year period. It's got 11 third order sequences in it. Those mean you got major eustatic sea level changes on the order of 1 to 2 million years. But inside of those third orders, you got numerous fourth order cycles inside of here. But I want to point out, this is going from the most landward, the seaward direction. This is still a moderate energy area, stress that's somewhat restricted. This is where a lot of the microbialites were and were deposited for a long time. I show the areas through here, some shoals and the more muddy areas in here. And what I'm trying to just say, within these cycles, a few wood shoals have developed, and also some laminated mudstone. And this is not really meant to be an island. This is a pictorial thing to remind us that during the time we had some exposure surfaces, you had some salinas of evaporites, meaning these were areas that were pretty restricted. Some of them were supertidal. You got evaporite nodules, others were salinas, and you got palmate structures. But again, just to help picture what's going on. Then getting back where it's more restricted, we had some laminated mudstones that were probably suspension deposits. And and shallow subtidal areas. Very rare burrowed mudstones. It's amazing. In this Ellenburger group, you find very few fossils. I mean, I can count on one hand the number of fossils I could actually recognize through the dolomite. But you also don't have that much burrowed sediment, which means it's a very restricted area. And then, as I said, you got some real sequences of peritidal material. These are laminated mudstones, stromatolites, and evaporites in there. And again, I'll bring out the problem of dolomization causes you real problems when you're trying to describe this stuff. You got to really worry to look through this coarse dolomite. What kind of grains are you looking at? So let's take a look at some of the facies in here. Here's first these microbialites or thrombolite complexes. And again, most of them are in through this area here. A few of them may have occurred elsewhere in the system. But as you can see in this slab here, here are some little domes right here. And again, to see these things, you've got a limited window of only a few inches. You go out on the outcrops in the Franklin Mountains out in El Paso, you can see some of these things and they're much bigger. They stand a few feet high and whatnot. But you can see these are very distinct features, even though they're dolomitized, their mega features show up. Here's domes. Here you can see these are thrombolites, microbialites, building upward, fingering outwards, very well developed vertical features in place. And again, here, some more domes, both complexes of them. And this is all supposed to be one core slab with a break in it. Here you can see they're laminated. In either of these, this is all microbial material still. These either were microbial sediments being deposited flat on the seafloor, or you're on top of a larger dome just by naturally on the top, you're going to have flat laminate. But these are indicating a stress, slow to moderate energy, shallow water setting. And getting in and looking at the thin sections of these things, through the dolomite, you can see some of the features. Here on the right, these are microbial peloids. These are precipitated by the microbial of the bacteria. You can see the well-developed peloids all through here. Sometimes they form chains, which are actually corresponding to the cemented layers that you're seeing in the stromatolites. Over here, these are interesting. These, first of all, this thin section is taken through a white card. You put a white card on your microscope and it causes the light to come up through it, diffuses it, and it helps the features show up. This is something I learned in Bob Folk's class 100 years ago. But it broke out these little things we call mesoclots. And you can see they're kind of radiating outward like this. But mesoclots are like bacterial colonies within microbialites. This is very indicative of bacterial growth, and they show up very nicely here. So the structures we can see in these things. Another thing embedded with the microbialites, you do get some grainstone complexes. Many of them are oolites, but the oolites only show up where they've been silicified. As they've been dolomitized, totally destroyed. But you can see some relic oolites in through here. Over here are the grainstone slabs. You can see rippling in them, current bedding in through here. So there are some periods of higher energy systems in here. And then also associated with microbialites in some of the cycles, you get a few other things. You get some peritidal material coming in here. These are algolaminae, essentially fairly flat looking. You often get mud cracks within these things and that. And then also you get some evaporites associated with them. In this area here, you have some bedded mudstones. These evaporite, these are now silicified actually, the evaporites, but you got these little evaporite nodules that grew in the sediment. Up here you have a intraglass conglomerate that was probably caused by a storm ripping up this material. And also during that time, it ripped up some of these and deposited the evaporite nodules with it. Here we have more solid evaporite. And again, this is silicified, but you see that's got kind of a vertical texture to it. These are called pelmate structures, and they grow in subtidal ponds. So instead of growing within the sediment itself, they're actually growing in a shallow saline body of water. And then here, associated again with these facies that through in the cycles, you just get more rip-up class. These are the mud class, typical Ellenburger tidal flats. And getting into the more subtidal environment, again, I said burrowing is very rare in the Ellenburger section of this particular core, but this looks like a very well bioturbated mudstone in through here. I look at it closely with the microscope, and I really cannot see any skeletal material. It's mainly peloidal material. And the lack of burrowed material, again, indicating what a stressed environment this must be. And coming back here into the peritidal complex area, I'm dealing with algolaminae again. These are fairly flat ones in through here. You get a few burrow-like organisms. These are like the polychaete burrows you see in modern carbonate flats today. They're little worms. But these form thick sequences in the area. Again, low energy stressed environment. Now the stacking patterns of all these is interesting. They're very broad stacking patterns that are consistent over quite an area that Charlie Kerans showed in a restricted Tobosa Basin area. The thrombolites dominated this lower part down through here again, but these are cyclic and through here. Then you get more intermixing of peritidal and thrombolites going up through here. And then at the very top, you get thick sequences of peritidal flat mudstones. But the sequence occurs quite consistently over a broad area. At the very top here, I can't say what was here, because this is all just cave sediment filled. At the very, very top, you're into a little bit more subtidal material. Okay, now get into the next section of this talk. I'm going to have to give you a real quick short course on karsting in order to understand the pore networks that I'm going to show later. Again, I'm pointing out at the end of the Ellenburger, you had this worldwide drop in sea level, and you got long periods of exposure. This is worldwide. So we see Lower Ordovician rocks around the world. And Hung Lu and I worked a bunch in China. The same rocks as the Ellenburger, showing extensive deep karsting. So this is a period of extensive karsting in through here. And again, within the core, we show that the top 700 feet of the rock has been karsted. Generally, it's only going down about 300 feet of good karsting. But in some places in the Franklin Mountains, and Virgil Barnes, an old bureau researcher here, have shown karsting in the Ellenburger getting down to 1,000 feet. They found strong chunks of rock and sinkholes 1,000 feet into the Ellenburger. And it's hard to think of the hydrology on a broad platform that would do that. So a quick course, the next two slides, they usually take a few hours to go through with other things, but this is a karsted area. It means you got a lot of dissolution. A karst means a zone of intense dissolution. And this is just a little model I put together some time ago showing what a modern karst system looks like. You got a surface of dissolution, you get some erosional remnants at the top. But what's happening is you got a lot of internal drainage. You're going to have shafts going down, you're going to have canyons going down into the rock, you got phreatic tubes down here. So you've got a zone in here of a megapore network going on with a lot of earlier fracturing associated with it. And the other thing to note is karsting will take place in stages. As base level drops, you get a new zone of tubes taking place like these down here. So you go down through a karst system like Mammoth Cave, which has 6, 7 zones of development. The oldest zones are up here working their way down and down and down. So over time, you get this big 3D body of megapore network. And associated with that, you're going to have, again, fractures. You're going to have a lot of breccias, a lot of cave sediment fills coming in, terra rosas are at the surface. But the important thing to note, and I'm going to try to get across, is that when you're dealing with things like producing hydrocarbons or exploring for hydrocarbons in the Ellenburger, or injecting CO2 or injecting wastewater, you're not doing it into an individual cave passage. You're going to you're doing it into cave zones that are collapsed. That's the point I'm going to try to get across with this slide. We're not dealing with individual passages, but large zones that are thick and wide, up to thousands of feet wide and hundreds of feet thick. But you take an individual cave passage, you often start out with a phreatic, started out with a phreatic tube down here shaped like an airplane wing. If you go out the Longhorn Caverns, you'll see some beautiful passages like this. But this is in the phreatic zone, is in the saturated zone. When base level drops, you bring this up into the vadose zone. So now we're the cave ceiling was supported by about the water supported about 30% of the rocks above it. You take that support away and the strata becomes unstable and it will collapse. And so you start to get a lot of early brecciation. The ceilings and walls will actually collapse. You can see this in some large cave systems today. Actually see the cracks in the ceilings and also in the walls. So fracturing and collapse and whatnot starts early, but then as it gets buried, it's all going to collapse. Because when you get down to 6,000, 9,000 feet plus, you don't have the large voids open anymore. I've done statistics on following when things collapse on the subsurface. You can hold large voids open down to 6,000 feet, then they're pretty much collapsed. 9,000 is usually over with. So collapse takes place over a long period of time. So that's what's happening with one cave. But that's not what you're dealing with in the Ellenburger. You're dealing with cave systems. Like here's a cross section with a cave, modern cave zone here, modern cave zones here, showing multi-layers. And it's just like, say, Cross Mammoth Cave, which I'll show you in a second. But here you develop these well-developed cave system, but at a sequence of several, at a boundary of several million years, like at the end of the Ellenburger, where you've got exposure, you're going to get cave system on top of cave system developing. So it's going to get very intense. Then you bury this. What do you end up with? You end up with zones of coalesced, like coalesced collapsed paleo cave systems. These can be anywhere from hundreds of feet wide to a mile or so wide. And this is what we're drilling for when we drill for the Ellenburger. And above it, you get very distinct collapse systems. And on seismic, these show up beautifully, which we have done a lot of work on and showed in publications. So bugs can stay open. Okay, I want to point out again, there's multiple stages of collapse and fracturing. Caves can stay open till 9,000 feet of burial, and they coalesce. And this is what I'm showing here. So these are pods that are somewhat with chaotic breccias and stuff in them, but mainly they got faults and crackle breccias connecting them. And to bring you through this idea of collapsing over time, I take Mammoth Cave right here. Mammoth Cave is a very large cave in Kentucky. It's got 400 to 1,000 miles of cave passages. There's 6 levels of passages. And if you notice here, they occur in zones. It's not everything here is karsted. They show up in zones. And this is curious. You see the same thing when you map out paleo cave systems. You get often a rectilinear pattern. But take a look at this area A up here. This is looking down. This is a map. You got 6 levels of passages here. You can see it looks quite dense. But again, when you're drilling, you're not drilling for something like this. What you're going to do, okay, let's take a look at this cross section here. Here's a cross section in different layers in through here. And what you can do, you clap this thing. Each one of these voids is going to give you a zone of collapse, of stress, where the rocks are going to sag down into these things. And these can reach up quite a bit. And they overlap each other. And in the end, they form one large zone of collapse or sag. And what happens in here, by the time you get down to 9,000 feet, if you were to bury this, you get this broad, this little cartoon right here, this broad zone of coalesced collapsed paleo cave system. And that pretty much looks like what I was just saying with my idea model right here. And again, these are wide areas. Take a look at this more of a map view. You're not going to be drilling for one of these, and this is really cartoonish. You're going to have this broad brecciated zone composed of breccias, tremendous amount of crackle breccias. I'll show you what these breccias mean in a few minutes. Numerous faults in through here, but it takes these individual zones here and commingles them together. They're connected by fractures and whatnot. So here are some of the karst breccias in through here. And this is a diagram I put together to help explain these. Here we got crackle breccias where you just break the rock apart. You can fit it right back together. Down here, the other point, chaotic breccias are totally random. Some came from the ceiling, some came by sediment transport through the cave during flooding. Then in the other corner, you got cave sediment fill that will mix in with these breccias. This diagram is important in the sense of recognizing your different types of breccias and how it interacts with cave sediment fill. Because over here, you got crackle breccia that can be fitted right back together. Mosaic breccias, they move apart a little bit. Chaotic breccias, they can be totally random, polymictic, several sources. But these over here, they have no cave sediment fill in them, have good potential to be reservoirs or have permeability. If you put cave sediment fill in them, they tighten up. And so let's look at a couple of the, here's a crackle breccia in the core. It's filled with a saddle dolomite here, but you can see the strong brecciation of these, very intense brecciation. But you can fit all this right back together. Here's some mosaic breccias, and through here, you can see they're broken, but you can fit those two pieces back together. Here's a chaotic breccia. It's polymictic, meaning you got material coming in from different sources. There was a lot of pore space in between these and through here. This is all filled with a hydrothermal type of dolomite. So in the Ellenburger, there's a lot of crackle and chaotic breccia, but because of the depth of burial at about 12,000 feet here, they're filled with a lot of hydrothermal dolomite. Now I want to point out, again, an interesting feature in here. This is the top of the core. You got 105-foot cave sediment fill in through here. This is awful thick for a cave fill. A normal cave height statistically is only about 8 feet high, looking at modern cave systems. If you have one 30 feet high, that's high. That's a big cave. And so this is an anomaly. And if you look over here, this is a well 2,000 feet away from the McElroy State Ranch core. This is only about 20 feet thick. This is a normal cave right here. This is by the SP and the certificate logs. We know this has a clay-rich fill in through here. Over here, it's quite thick. My interpretation of this is a sinkhole. It's not a cave passage, but it's just a big sinkhole, like Devil's Sinkhole out in the hill country area. It's a big, deep hole in the ground. And it would look like something like this. And this is where the core would have gone down through it. Here's the big sinkhole. You get piles of sediment through here with some breccias in there, and they're going to have high angle repose on the side. Now let's take a look at that. Here's the core through that thing. You see the sediments at high angles through here, high angle. And what you're seeing here is you're seeing cave sediment fill with a lot of class in it because the stuff's being dumped down from the top, forms these big piles of sediment, which like you see in caves today. And then the sediment during storms and stuff, it gets reactivated. You actually get little debris flows down the thing. And that's what you're seeing here. Here are some sand layers that are highly contorted because it's got moved down slope again. And the sand material in here is awful sandy. This is some thin sections of material. This material is mainly Simpson in age. That's younger than the Ellenburger. And we know it's Simpson because you do conodont micropaleontology on it, and it comes up. These are abraded Simpson conodonts within this sediment down here. But looking at the thin sections, here is some of the Simpson sand. A lot of it's beautifully rounded, coarse sand with finer sand in between. This is typical of desert sand. And Simpson was across the Simpson surface, desert sand was going along, and some of that stuff fell into the sinkhole. The dolomite associated with it is eroded or abraded dolomite. You can see these large dolomite crystals. They're broken and abraded in there. So it shows by the time of Simpson, the Ellenburger was highly dolomitized because that's getting eroded and put back into the cave sediments. Now to the important thing of the pore networks in here. This is what you need to know for CO2 injection, hydrocarbon production, and wastewater disposal. There's two main types in this particular Ellenburger core. Some of it's related to matrix, some of it related to karsting. The matrix-related pores, they're in with these thrombolite or microbialites. They're a little larger, vuggy pores. You see them through here. They're occurring along the layers of the microbialites or the microbialite crusts. And over here, you see them again, associated microbialites. Modern microbialites and microbialites from other formations I've studied all have large bugs in them. And so this is a natural feature in here. Here this is a thin section scan. And again, you can see the large pores in here. Here is some intercrystalline pores associated with these things, but these are pretty dominant through the microbial system. And the question though is, this is obviously good for storage, but how well connected are they? And I guess they got to be, because in this particular zone, this zone produced a lot of water when it was tested, when it was drilled. Here are some more of the karst-related. Oh yeah, okay. Here are the karst-related pores. This is a chaotic breccia. You can see within the breccias themselves, there are large vugs still in here. A lot of this white material is a saddle dolomite, hydrothermal dolomite. But these are good chance. These are well connected to other pore spaces, and these will give you high permeability. Thin section through here, the thin section scan. The blue here is porosity. So even though these fractures are partly filled with saddle dolomite and even some cave sediment fill, there is porosity still left. A crackle breccia type, this is where you intensely crackle or break up the rock into a lot of small pores, a lot of small fractures. You see there's porosity. And again, in thin section, a lot of cement reduction, but there are still pores along these things. And then there's one other pore type that's not very common, but it's interesting to the Ellenburger. In the very deep, well, in the Ellenburger throughout it, you get some of these, you get larger vugs that can be several inches across. And I'm trying to show it here. This is an important one here because the rock face is, this is the rock face. This is looking at it down at an angle. But you can see there's made up of a breccia. This was cave sediment fill that's lithified. So these vugs are coming after lithification. And the vugs are loaded with saddle dolomite, these large crystals right here. So these are very late hydrothermal features, I believe. And this is similar. Here you got the rock broken up into pieces. You got a saddle dolomite rim around each of the class. Then this is very, very late subsurface anhydrite, which I don't know the origin of. Let's see, just a couple more slides. And here for the reservoir quality now, the Ellenburger, this database I'm going to show you here is based upon an old database that I collected I used while I was at ARCO some years ago. And it's from the near-end database, 1984, but it's nice. They took pool data of a bunch of Ellenburger reservoirs scattered through Texas and took the average porosity and permeability. You can see down here, our 12,000 foot depth, porosities are low, generally less than 5,000 feet, but permeabilities are still relatively high, getting up to 100 millidarcies. And the type of pore network you're dealing with, this is a plot of pores varying with depth, but what I want to just show basically here and just say is that larger vugs have pretty much disappeared by the time you get down to 12,000 feet. Your major pore type relative to karst are crackle breccias, which I've showed you. And what's important out of all this was this all leading to Chris Am and Xavier Jansen have been looking at some Ellenburger production curves, and they're coming up with, this is your typical karst production curve where you got a lot of karst fractures, low matrix porosity. This is how production would decrease. But they find some like this, where production goes on quite for a long time, which indicating something else contributing to this, which would generally be matrix porosity. The example I showed you of the macroid core, yeah, shows some macro porosity, but most of the cores I've looked in the Ellenburger does not have much macro porosity. Generally has only 3, or by macro I mean matrix, has only 3 to 5% porosity. This would indicate higher porosities. And so we're going to be taking a look at more Ellenburger core to try to explain or recognize the differences between these two production curves. So parting comments, the Ellenburger contains both matrix and karst-related pore networks. Reservoir quality is low, but permeability can be high because of karst fractures. And the karst fractures are more related to the upper part of the Ellenburger because that's where the meteor karsting is. In our particular cores, the matrix pores are the lower part of the Ellenburger. And we should always expect a lot of variability in reservoir quality. And an article from our co-author, Taylor Sanchez, he published, shows that the Ellenburger could take some pretty good rates of water injection. And just one further comment, further investigations we'd like to do, we'd like to understand these production curves. Now go back where we got production curves, look for cores, and see what kind of pore networks we're dealing with. Whoops. It's supposed to be 231 plus. Oh, it is plus. 231 plus. In our core warehouse, we have over 231 plus Ellenburger cores. I would love to get to them all, but I may not. I like to document the pore types by the pore networks by pore type, mineralogy, depth, and regional distribution. So we still got more work to do. Thank you. Okay, questions?
Thank you, Bob.
Hi, Bob. One question's on wastewater or saltwater disposal. Do they usually dispose the water in upper or lower Ellenburger? You know?
At the no, that's something you probably have to be asking Chris Resolve. I've not gotten it. I'm doing the background data, the reservoir characterization. I'm not getting into all the problems of the water itself yet.
So the porosity is low, so it doesn't have a lot of. If it's thick, then you have enough storage space for water. Otherwise,
the lower part I've showed you where you got the thrombolite or microbial pores. I can see a lot of water going in there. The upper part, I just know it's low porosities, but permeabilities are high, and you can fit a lot of fluid can go in there. But I'm surprised some of the curves Chris came up with that show long production without that quick of a drop. But I want to point out though, the fracture networks in a karst system are not the same as tectonic fractures. Tectonic fractures, and Chris threw this out to me. Tectonic fractures generally you get 0.1% porosity. Karst fracture you might get 1%, maybe 2%. So there's still some. But again, if you only look at 4-inch wide core face, you're not seeing much of the system. So I'll go ahead.
no. So is there any CO2 injection into those for storage?
I don't know myself. You have to ask the CO2 group here, but the company that visited me, it just so happened they pulled this core. Didn't even know I ever worked on it. They're using this core because that's the area they're going to try to inject CO2 in. So obviously it's on the table for a CO2 injection.
Thank you.
Any more?
Hi, Bob. Thank you. Great talk. I'm just wondering, on all the Ellenburger core that you reviewed, Ellenburger goes across so much of the state. Have you mostly been working Ellenburger in the Permian Basin or other locations?
I mean, the area I've looked at?
Yes.
A lot in the Permian Basin and a bunch in the Fort Worth Basin, and a tremendous amount in the hill country, but that's for more lead zinc deposit type thing. But in the East, it's interesting, in the East Texas Basin, the Fort Worth Basin, they're also using the Ellenburger for water injection. Two things the Ellenburger up there causes problem. The Barnett wells, when you do a horizontal well, if you cross one of the old collapse zones, all the Ellenburger water will come up and blow your well away. On the other hand, though, a lot of your whole drilling fluid program will go down those fractures into the Ellenburger. But they use the Ellenburger for injection of wastewater. And like, it was interesting because I had a core about top 100 feet of the Ellenburger, which I was happy to get. And I gave a talk at APG. I said, no way are you going to inject water in this. And it turns out, because the Ellenburger is so thick, they're injecting it in about 1,000 feet or so down. So that's when you get into the Ellenburger karst systems, you're dealing with very complex rocks that can change from well to well over a few thousand feet, where you hit the most caves or not hit caves and stuff. But yeah, I've looked at anywhere in Texas you drill, or Oklahoma, they call it the Arbuckle, over in Tennessee, and there you call it the Knox, it's all karsted, just like this. Oh, you're going to answer my question on anhydrite?
I'll make a comment or two. So again, my views on the Great American Carbonate Bank is greatly biased by Knox work instead of Ellenburger work. But I didn't see a whole lot of rock boundaries to the matrix and the core. You know, it's always hard to see, and I know the limitation of working with core. But do you ever see bleached margins on the dilostone fragments, which is?
You mean from From
the-
weather,
the
from-
From the meteoric water egress.
It's interesting. Along fractures, I see some of the cores I've looked at, you see beautiful diagenetic zones along fractures where it looks like Lisa gang banding almost going out into them. I don't know if that's meteoric water or hydrothermal fluid. I'd have to say it's more hydrothermal fluids. In the quarries in Burnett, up in Marble Falls area and stuff like that, around the paleo caves, you do see zoning going out into the host rock of alteration.
Of course, that's modern surface, so hard to tell what's going on there. But that's kind of iconic of the Knox breccias where you get the bleached rims, and they definitely are not related to the late stage hydrothermal fluids, because you can see them broken and not unaffected by those. And then the other thing is, do you actually see fractures which are filled in by the matrix clays that you get in the sinkholes, or are the fractures mostly?
Oh yeah, it's very common.
Okay.
If I understand your question, why the early fractures in the Ellenburger that occurred while the rocks were still near surface on the cave floor get filled with clay beautifully. You see geopedal layers to them and all that. But that's one way you can semi-tell early fractures from late fractures. But that's not absolute, because some of the early modern ones still won't fill with clay. You see this very nicely when you study modern caves too, where the clays are starting to fill in between boulders and whatnot.
And the other thought I had was that if you really want to test the interconnected nature of these seemingly isolated pores, you could do computed tomography on these. So that would show up really well.
Well, the problem
at
is
the scale of core. Right?
Yeah, the scale of core.
Yeah.
I mean, the nice place you could do is like, again, the quarries up around Marble Falls and all that, we've done GPS, ground penetrating radar and stuff like that to look how well they're connected. And it's just, in the companies, we say you want a permeability value, you do a well test. Core itself is just going to give you an isolated, short, limited number.
Thanks.
So Bob, there is a question in a chat by David Carr. Great talk, Bob. Thank you. Do you know approximate what percentage of BEG CRC Ellenburger cores are modern? That is triple combo or similar logs available.
I lost you somewhere in there.
He's asking whether they have modern logs, triple combo logs.
You'd have to ask Chris on that. Most of the time, we probably have one core that's now about 15 years old that should have a good log suite that we have worked on and published on here. And it's a Barnhart core in Reagan County, Texas.
There's another comment by Peter Hennings. Saltwater disposal into the Ellenburger and the static and dynamic response is a good question for CISR. We have many studies underway on saltwater disposal into the Ellenburger in the Midland Basin, as well as the Delaware Basin. We will present on some of the top points soon.
What was the last part?
He will present something soon.
Okay, so okay.
Yeah.
He's got to talk, and they're going to give some.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So it's a comment.
Yeah, I realize the Bureau has a bunch of work going on this.
There's another question by Alexandro Savidis. Excellent presentation, Bob. Many thanks. TextNet published work shows that in the Delaware Basin, the seismicity is highly related to the injection at the Ellenburger. We see that produced water injection is traveling long distances, affecting the basement-rooted faults that go through the Ellenburger and slip, providing the current seismicity highest in the state. Do you consider that the karst networks can be the major force for water to travel from the north to the south?
You get north-south transport along the karst bridges.
I'd have to look at the data. I can't comment on it. Unless I'm missing it, I can't comment on that.
There's another question by Toti. Really nice talk, Bob, and great science. What is the relative timing between matrix and VUG porosity development?
Matrix and what? Okay, it depends what kind of the bugs associated with the microbialites, they're painting contemporaneous. They're part of the building of the crust on microbialites. But to the very, very, okay, but then there's other bugs associated with the karst breccias themselves. Then there's bugs with the late hydrothermal dissolution, subsurface dissolution. So bugs form at many different times in these rocks.
We still have few minutes. If anybody have question, they can unmute themselves, or if there isn't, then
Okay, thank you all.
okay.
Oh, you done?
Okay, I think nobody's unmuting and asking. So thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Bob, for the great talk.